Hey, 6th graders, Mrs. Simonson here. Tonight we are starting Unit 7 with Lesson 1, which is comparing fractions. Our one objective is to compare fractions using number sense and common denominators. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be covering 5 different methods you can use to compare fractions, and I would suggest that you take notes on each of the methods in your notebook. The first method is consider the piece size. When we have a fraction, remember that the denominators indicate how many pieces the whole is divided into. In this first case, I am comparing 2/6 and 5/6, and since they have the same denominator, they would have the same piece size. So then I can just go ahead and compare the numerators, which indicate the quantity of pieces I have. When I have 2/6 and I want to compare them to 5/6, 2 is less than 5, so 2/6 is less than 5/6. Well, what happens when the piece size is different, like in this case, 3/4 and 3/5? Well, let's look to our visual models to help understand this. When we have a whole that's divided into fourths, each piece is this size. When I have a whole that's divided into fifths, we have this size. Now notice that when you divide a whole into more pieces, each piece is smaller in size. So in this case, since we have the same quantities, I really want to consider the piece size. Fourths are a larger piece than fifth. So if I have 3 of those larger pieces compared to 3 of the smaller pieces, the larger size pieces are going to be larger. So 3/4 is greater than 3/5. Now when I compare more than one fraction, I suggest thinking about comparing the first two and then comparing to the third using some of those tricks I just showed you. So I have 3/10 and 3/5, and I have the same quantity, so I can use that theory about considering the piece size. If I have a whole that's divided into 10 pieces, those pieces will be smaller than a whole that's divided only into 5 pieces. And if I have 3 of both of those sizes, 3/10 is going to be less than 3/5. Now I can compare the third. It's 2/10. Well, if 3/10 was less than 3/5, 2/10 is also going to be less than 3/5. Saying in the other direction, 3/5 is going to be greater than 2/10. I want you to practice using that method to compare the following fractions. Copy problems 1, 2, and 3 in your notebook, and then press play when you're ready to check your work. Another method you can use to compare fractions is called the half benchmark. In thinking of terms of whether a fraction is greater than or less than a half. I'll show you how this works. If I have the fraction 2/3, I want to think about that 3. Half of 3 would be 1.5. So to have half of a third, I would need 1.5 thirds. I have 2/3, so 2/3 is slightly greater than a half. Now in this fraction, I have tenths. Half of tenths would be 5/10. So 5/10 would be the half benchmark, and I only have 1/10, so I'm less than a half. So 2/3 was slightly greater than a half, and 1/10 was less than a half, so 2/3 has to be greater than 1/10. In this one, 5/11, half of 11 is 5.5, so I'm slightly under a half. And in sevenths, 3.5, 3.5 would be the half benchmark, and I'm slightly over in that case. So when I compare a fraction that's slightly under to a fraction that's slightly over, the fraction that's slightly over a half will be larger. I want you to practice using the half benchmark method to compare the following fractions. Copy problems 4, 5, and 6 in your notebook and press play when you're ready to check your work. A third method for comparing fractions is called consider the residual. This works when fractions are just missing one piece in order to make a whole. So in this case, 4/5, the residual, the leftover, would be 1/5. And in 8/9, what's missing or what's left over is 1/9. Now I can compare using one of the previous methods, the size piece. If I have fifths, those are larger pieces than the ninths, and since I have one of each, 1/5 is greater than 1/9, which means 4/5 is missing a larger piece than 8/9, which means 8/9 is going to be a larger whole than 4/5. In 3/4, 1/4 is missing, and in 14/15, 1/15 is missing. Again, the 15th is going to be a smaller piece than a fourth, and if I have one of each, 1/4 is going to be a greater missing or greater leftover, which means that 3/4 is going to be smaller than 14/15. So thinking about the greater residual will be the smaller fraction. All right, let's try this one. So we have 1/7, 1/16, and 1/11. So when we are comparing 1/7 and 1/16, 1/7 is a greater residual, which means 6/7 is the smaller fraction. When I compare 1/16 and 1/11, 1/16 is a smaller piece than 1/11, so 1/11 is greater, which means that 15/16 is the greater fraction. Play with method 3 to compare the fractions, thinking about the residual. Copy problems 7, 8, and 9 in your notebook, and press play when you're ready to check your work.
A fourth method is to use common denominators. That's really making the fractions have the same size pieces. Right now I have a size that's a third and a size that's an eighth, and I want to be able to compare them when they have the same size. So one common method is to multiply both fractions by the other fraction's denominators and make an equivalent fraction. So 1/3 is equivalent to 8/24, and 3/8 is equivalent to 9/24. Now I have the same size pieces, and I can just compare the quantities I have. 8 pieces is less than 9 pieces. So 8/24 is less than 9/24, and 1/3 is less than 3/8. Again, you would just multiply both fractions by the other fraction's denominators. So I have 45/54 and 42/54. 45 is more than 42, so 5/6 is more than 7/9. I want you to use the common denominator method to compare the fractions for problems 10, 11, and 12. Use greater than, less than, or equal sign, and press play when you're ready to check your work. You'll notice in problem 11 I didn't need to change 13/15 to any equivalent fraction because I could make fifths equivalent to 15ths. And in number 12, I chose to use what's called the least common denominator. It's finding the least common multiple of 20 and 25, which in this case is 100. I did that because it makes a little friendlier multiplication than trying to multiply 25 times 17 and 21 times 20 and 20 times 25 to find a larger denominator. Easy trick. You take the numerator of the first fraction and multiply it by the denominator of the second. 7 times 5 is 35. Then you take the denominator of the first, multiply it by the numerator of the second, and that's 45. 45 is larger than 35, so 3/5 is larger than 7/15. 7/15 is less than 3/5. Let's try it again. Numerator of the first fraction times the denominator of the second. 6 times 9 is 54. Denominator of the first times the numerator of the second. 11 times 8 is 88. 88 is larger than 54, so 8/9 is larger, greater than 6/11, or reverse, 6/11 is less than 8/9. All right, we want you to try this method by solving problems 13 and 14. Use the cross products to do it, and use greater than, less than, or equals to, and press play when you're ready to check your work. So again, tonight you learned 5 different methods for comparing fractions, using reasoning about their sizes, half benchmark, using the residual, common denominators, and cross products. Any of the 5 methods work. Sometimes they work better with certain fractions than others, but if you have those 5 things in your toolbox, you'll be pretty equipped to compare fractions. Review any of those methods before you take your quiz at Schoology, and we'll see you next time.